I have an autistic son named Aiden. People in our neighborhood think I've been a little intense lately. I've heard that phrasing twice now. Once from another parent who tried to soften it with a laugh, and once from Kyle when he thought I couldn't hear him on the phone with a friend. But the truth is, I've been doing what I've always done for my son, stepping in when other people quietly step back. My younger boy Aiden is 7, my older one Kyle is 13 and would rather pretend none of this involves him. Their dad travels for work most weeks, which means most of the daily managing falls on me. Aiden has developmental delays and sensory regulation issues. He's not violent, he's not cruel, he's just big energy in a small space, loud sometimes, too close to people sometimes. He flaps his hands when he's excited. When he gets overwhelmed, he bangs things or yells or talks too fast. Most adults see that and immediately start calculating distance. So I've spent years doing the explaining before anyone asks. At birthday parties, at playgrounds, at school orientation meetings. I'm used to the looks, the polite nods, the parents who suddenly remember they need to leave. When we moved to this neighborhood a few months ago, I honestly thought it might be different. It looked like the kind of street where kids ride bikes and everyone knows each other's dogs. There's a little park about 2 blocks away. A few weeks after we moved in, I was chatting with one of the dads who lives nearby. Tall guy, early 40s maybe, calm voice. The kind of person who seems comfortable in his own space. He mentioned that every Saturday morning he takes his youngest son to the park. They call it their dude walk, which honestly sounded kind of sweet. Apparently a few other families show up too, and the kids run around while the parents drink coffee. He told me if I wanted to meet some neighbors, I should bring Aiden, so the next Saturday I did. I remember standing there the first time watching Aiden sprint straight towards the play structure before I'd even finished saying hello to anyone. That moment where you hold your breath because you know your child is about to introduce himself in the loudest possible way. And he did, climbing too fast, smacking the metal railings with his hands, talking at a volume that made a couple of the other kids pause. But he was happy, laughing, trying to join whatever game the others were playing. I sat on the bench with the other parents and did the usual quiet corrections when needed. Nothing aggressive happened, no hitting, no pushing, just a lot of enthusiasm. The other kids looked unsure at first, which I expected, but after a few minutes they went back to their game and Aiden tried to follow along. I thought it went pretty well, honestly. We kept coming back on Saturdays. The dad who invited us, his name's Mark, usually brought his younger son Sam. Sam's about 6, very polite kid. Be careful the way some kids are. His older boy James sometimes came too, though James mostly stayed with another group of older kids. For a few weeks everything felt normal enough. Aiden would get loud sometimes. I'd step in and redirect him. The kids would scatter and regroup and eventually pull him into whatever they were doing. Was it perfect? No. But it looked like kids figuring each other out. Then there was one Saturday where Aiden had a harder morning. Nothing unusual by our standards. Just more sensory stuff than usual. The park was crowded. A dog barked near the swings, someone brought one of those plastic toy swords, and the clacking noise kept setting him off. He started banging on the side of the slide platform and shouting about being the Dragon King or something. I was already walking over to calm him down when I saw Mark call Sam over. They sat on a bench together for a minute. Sam was whispering something and Mark nodded. Then they packed up and left. It happened quickly. No goodbyes to the kids, just a quiet exit. I didn't think much of it at first. Kids get tired. But later that afternoon, Aiden asked me if Sam was mad at him. That's the thing people don't realize. Aiden notices more than they think. So the next day, I walked over to Mark's house. I wasn't angry. I was trying to be proactive. When he answered the door, I told him that when parents quietly pull their kids away, the other children notice. And sometimes it helps if adults explain why someone behaves differently. I suggested he talk to Sam about kids who communicate or regulate differently. Mark seemed polite enough, said they'd talk about it. The next Saturday, Sam did say hi to Aiden. I noticed it immediately. Aiden noticed it too. They played together for a bit, chasing each other around the climbing structure, until Aiden got loud again. He does this thing when he's excited where his voice jumps an octave and he flaps his arms like he's about to take off. Some kids laugh, some kids step back. Sam climbed all the way up to the top platform, where Aiden usually won't go because he's nervous about heights. Later, Aiden asked him to be his partner in a game. I heard Sam say something like, "No, thank you." And Aiden stood there for a moment like he wasn't sure where to go next. That's when Mark's wife approached me a few days later and invited us over to their house. I'll admit, I felt relieved. Sometimes kids just need a smaller environment to connect. The visit actually went mostly fine. Aiden had one meltdown when a toy train set stopped working, but I managed it quickly and we moved on. Sam stayed polite the entire time. Afterwards, I told Kyle it seemed like things might be smoothing out. Kyle shrugged and said he didn't really like Sam's older brother James. Apparently, James had been making comments to some of the other older kids about Kyle smelling weird. Teenage boy stuff. Kyle showered and muttered that he didn't care anyway. I tried to focus on the positive. Then the toy incident happened. It was another Saturday at the park. Aiden had got hold of some kind of action figure that belonged to Sam. I didn't see exactly what happened at first, I just heard the snap. By the time I looked over, the toy was in pieces on the ground, arms and legs twisted off. Aiden sometimes grips things too hard when he's overstimulated. Sam looked like someone had just smashed his birthday cake. He yelled at Aiden, loud enough for everyone to hear, something like, "You were a very mean boy." I remember that exact sentence because Aiden repeated it in the car later, not crying, just confused. Mark didn't make Sam apologize. They just packed up and left again. And after that, something shifted. For a couple of weeks, we kept showing up at the park Saturday mornings like usual, but fewer of the families came. At first, I assumed it was weather or soccer games or whatever else people do with their weekends. Then, one Saturday, the park was nearly empty. Just me and Aiden and a dad I didn't recognize walking a dog. Later that afternoon, Kyle mentioned seeing Sam and two of the other kids riding bikes near the park. In the afternoon, not the morning. At first I told myself it was coincidence. Schedules change. But over the next couple weeks, I kept hearing little things. One mom mentioning she'd started bringing the kids later in the day, another saying mornings had gotten busy, and eventually it became pretty clear what was happening. The Saturday group hadn't disappeared. It had just moved. Not officially, no announcement, no conversation, just a quiet shift in time that somehow everyone knew about except us. And I sat on that park bench one morning watching Aiden run back and forth across the empty grass field, laughing to himself, completely unaware that an entire group of children had simply rearranged their lives around avoiding him. That's when I started feeling that old familiar pressure building in my chest, the one I get when I realize I'm about to have to explain my son to the world again. Because if people were choosing to move an entire community activity instead of teaching their kids how to handle differences, then someone needed to say something. So I wrote Mark a letter, not an angry one, just honest. I told him that whether he meant to or not, his influence in the neighborhood carried weight. When he pulled away, other parents seemed to follow. And I said I wished he had done more to help Sam understand that Aiden wasn't someone to avoid. I didn't accuse him of organizing anything, but I did ask if he could see how the outcome looked from where I was sitting. Because from my perspective, an entire group of children had just learned that when someone is different enough, you don't have to say anything cruel, you just quietly move the game somewhere else. I didn't expect the letter to fix anything overnight. That wasn't really the point. I wanted Mark to understand the ripple effect of what had happened. When one parent quietly pulls away, the others tend to follow the safest direction. He didn't respond for 3 days. Not a text, not a knock on the door, nothing. Then Thursday evening he came by. I could tell right away he'd already decided how the conversation was going to go. Some people carry that kind of calm authority where you can feel the outcome before the first sentence is spoken. He said he'd read the letter carefully. Then he said something I still think about. He said Sam had asked for space from Aiden 3 separate times and they had listened. He said kids are allowed to set boundaries about how they want to play. He said Sam wasn't rude and wasn't cruel, and he wasn't going to force him to interact in ways that made him uncomfortable. Then he added that they hadn't told any other families to change their schedules. People had made their own choices. I remember standing there on my porch thinking about all the years I've spent trying to convince people that inclusion doesn't happen naturally. Adults have to guide it. If you leave it up to children alone, they sort themselves into easy groups. And Aiden has never been easy. I told Mark that when a whole group of kids suddenly starts avoiding one child, the adults should step in. He said he had stepped in for his son. That was the moment I realized we were talking about 2 completely different responsibilities. He left after that. Once he walked away, I knew the letter hadn't solved anything. If anything, it had clarified the situation. The following Saturday, I still took Aiden to the park in the morning. I didn't want to give him the message that we were the ones who had to adjust. Kyle refused to come. He said he had homework, which meant he didn't want to deal with the younger kids staring at his brother again. So it was just me and Aiden. The park was empty again. Aiden didn't mind at first. He ran up the climbing structure and announced he was guarding the castle from invisible enemies. I sat on the bench watching him, trying not to think about the fact that 6 weeks earlier that same park had been full of kids. After about 20 minutes he came over and asked where Sam was. I told him Sam probably had other plans. Aiden nodded and went back to playing. Then he asked again 10 minutes later. That's the thing about Aiden. When something changes in his routine, it circles in his head like a loose marble. Eventually he asked if Sam was still mad about the toy. I told him no, but the question stayed with me the rest of the day. That evening, Kyle came home from a friend's house looking annoyed. Apparently James, Mark's older kid, had been telling people that Aiden broke toys and screamed at the park. Kyle said a couple kids laughed about it. He tried to brush it off while telling me, but I could see the way his shoulders were tight. Kyle has spent his whole life explaining his brother to people. He doesn't say it out loud often, but I know it weighs on him. That night, I started thinking about the larger picture. If the other parents believed the version of events where Aiden was simply the kid who ruined playtime, they were going to keep drifting away. Not because they were cruel people, but because nobody likes friction in something that's supposed to be relaxing. And that's how kids like Aiden slowly disappear from community spaces. So the following week, I started doing what I've had to do before in other places. I started talking to people individually, not confrontationally, just conversations. One mom while we were both checking mailboxes. Meanwhile, our kids were getting off the school bus. I explained that Aiden struggles with regulation when he's overstimulated. I mentioned the progress he's made over the last year. I pointed out that the kids had played together for several weeks before things shifted. I also told them that when children see adults quietly reorganizing social spaces to avoid one kid, they learn that exclusion is acceptable as long as it's polite. Most of the parents nodded. Some looked uncomfortable. A couple said they hadn't realized the part time had shifted intentionally. But a few days later, I started hearing small changes in tone. One dad asked whether Aiden had an aide at school. Another parent asked if he had behavioral outbursts often. The questions weren't aggressive, but they carried a certain distance. Meanwhile, the Saturday park situation stayed the same. Morning was quiet. The afternoon was full. Kyle eventually told me that the kids had started calling it the late park group. He heard it from someone at school. That phrase bothered me more than I expected, because it meant the change had solidified into something normal. A routine built around not overlapping with my child. Then something else happened that complicated things even more. One afternoon, Sam and Aiden crossed paths outside the park by accident. I saw them from across the sidewalk. Aiden got excited immediately and ran over. Sam froze for a second, clearly unsure what to do. He said hello. Aiden started talking fast about a game he wanted to play. Sam looked towards his dad, who had just come around the corner. Mark walked up calmly and asked Sam if he wanted to stay or head home. Sam hesitated. Then he said they were about to leave anyway. Aiden stood there watching them walk away, and later that night he asked me if Sam didn't like him anymore. I told him sometimes kids need space, but inside my head something kept replaying. Mark gives Sam the choice, not pushing him, not guiding him back into the interaction, just letting the distance stand. From his perspective, he was respecting his child's comfort. From mine, he was reinforcing a boundary that had already grown too big. A few days after that, I heard something from another parent that changed the whole tone of things. Apparently, several families had started coordinating the afternoon park time in a group chat. Nothing malicious in the messages, just scheduling. But my name wasn't in the chat, neither was Aiden's, which meant the separation had become organized, even if nobody would call it that. I'll admit that was the moment my patience started slipping. Because I've spent years helping Aiden learn how to exist in spaces that aren't built for him, teaching him to lower his voice, teaching him to ask before joining games, teaching him to recognize when other kids need breathing room, and he's made progress, real progress, but progress only works if the world meets him halfway. If everyone else just shifts away every time it gets slightly uncomfortable, he never gets the chance to practice. So I wrote another message, this time not just for Mark, to several parents. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. I said I understood that kids sometimes need breaks from overwhelming playmates. But when an entire group restructures itself around avoiding one child, it sends a message to every kid involved. I asked if we could reset the Saturday mornings and try again with clearer expectations. Not forcing friendships, just giving the kids another chance to figure things out. A couple parents responded politely. One said they appreciated the perspective. Another said weekends had become complicated with sports schedules. Mark didn't respond. Neither did two of the families who had originally been part of the morning group. And that's where things stand right now. The park still fills up on Saturday afternoons. Aiden and I still go in the morning. Kyle avoids the whole situation entirely, and I keep hearing small pieces of feedback from different directions that I'm pushing too hard. The parents feel uncomfortable. The kids shouldn't be forced into social dynamics they don't want. Maybe that's true. Maybe I am pushing. But I also know how quickly kids like Aiden get erased from community spaces when nobody pushes at all. So I'm sitting here wondering whether I crossed a line by confronting people about it. Did I make the situation worse by trying to fight the quiet shift? Or was I right to call attention to something everyone else seemed willing to pretend wasn't happening? Because right now it feels like I'm being labeled the difficult parent for refusing to let my son disappear politely. I honestly don't know anymore. So I'm asking, what would you have done in my place? Opinions 1 said, you are wrong, but not because you love your son too much. It's because you keep swapping out the word controls for advocacies and acting like that changes what you're doing. Your son is not being erased. He's being avoided by kids who have already tried him and found him stressful. That sucks. But it is not some civil rights case because a 6-year-old doesn't want a playmate who gets in his face, yells, breaks his stuff, and makes him feel tense at the park. Sam didn't call Aiden names. He didn't mock him. He didn't rally other kids against him. He asked for space. Repeatedly, his parents listened. That is literally what decent parents are supposed to do. And honestly, your biggest blind spot is that you keep describing every social consequence like it came out of nowhere. It didn't. There was buildup. Adults saw their kids coming home dysregulated. Kids were uneasy. A toy got broken. Your older son already has social fallout attached to his brother, which tells me this pattern did not start on this street. None of that makes Aiden bad. It does mean other people get to respond to reality instead of the version you want them to perform. Mark isn't using influence. He's parenting his own child. The other parents probably moved because they reached the same conclusion on their own. Saturday mornings stop being easy. You don't get to demand communal sacrifice and call it inclusion. What really got me is that Kyle is waving giant red flags, and you are still locked onto the neighborhood optics. That kid is carrying resentment, embarrassment, and probably guilt for even feeling those things. He needs room to be a full person, not a supporting actor in your campaign. Same with Aiden, actually. He needs support, structure, and maybe better matched social settings, not forced access to kids who already withdrew. You're not wrong that exclusion can be quiet and ugly. You are wrong that the answer is to lean on everyone until they submit. That's not inclusion. That's hostage-taking with nicer vocabulary. Another one said, I actually feel bad for all 4 kids here, and I think the adults are making it worse in different ways. You, first. I believe you are tired in that bone-deep way only parents of high-needs kids really understand. You've probably spent years walking into rooms already braced for judgment, so now you read every retort as prejudice before it's even fully formed. I get why. But that survival mechanism is screwing you over here because it flattens everything into the same story. People are excluding my son because he's different. Sometimes yes. Sometimes people are backing off because the interaction genuinely isn't working for their child. Those are not the same thing, and you're treating them like they are. Mark, though, isn't as neutral as he wants to seem. He may not have organized the shift, but adults set the tone with a look, a shrug, the timing of when they leave, and who they keep inviting over. Neighborhood groups are soft power machines. Nobody has to say, let's avoid Aiden. They just watch who the socially central parents are making room for and who they're quietly done with. So I don't fully buy this clean hands act where he's just minding his own business. He probably didn't mastermind anything, but he absolutely helped normalize the distance. His wife also made a mistake inviting you over if they already knew Sam was uncomfortable and they weren't prepared to navigate that honestly. That just created one more, let's see if this works, moment for your son to fail in. And once the toy got broken, that was probably the emotional point of no return for Sam. Sam is not wrong. That kid has been direct, polite, and consistent. Adults should pay attention when a child says, I don't want this anymore, without being cruel. James sounds like a standard middle school arsehole, which is ugly but not exactly rare. Kyle, though, is the one I can't stop thinking about. He seems like he's been drafted into a family role he didn't choose. He's old enough to understand the social cost, young enough to have no real power over it, and probably angry at everybody. My honest read is that your son needs a setting with more active scaffolding and better matched kids, not a neighborhood free play group where everything depends on tolerance and improvising. That's not me saying he should be hidden away. I'm saying inclusion without structure usually turns into one child being resented and one parent becoming the hall monitor of everybody else's morality. So yeah, I think you crossed lines. I also think the neighborhood took the path of least resistance instead of saying the hard thing out loud. Nobody here looks great except maybe Sam, who somehow managed to be the clearest communicator in the whole story. Continuation. I wasn't planning to come back this soon, but things escalated in a way I honestly didn't see coming. A few people asked what happened after my last post, and a lot of others said I needed to step back and let things settle. I did try, for a little while, but the situation kept evolving, and every time I thought things might level out, something else would happen that made it very clear where our family stood in this neighborhood. The first thing I tried to do was fix the one moment that had clearly stuck in everyone's mind, the toy incident. I kept thinking about that because kids latch on to simple stories. Aiden breaks things is a very easy story for them to repeat, especially when adults don't step in to reshape it. So I bought Sam the exact same action figure that had been broken. I tracked it down online and waited almost a week for it to arrive. When it finally did, I walked it over to their house. My intention was simple: replace the toy, show good faith, reset the tone. Mark opened the door. I handed him the box and told him I wanted Sam to have a replacement because accidents happen, and I didn't want him feeling like something important to him had just been destroyed without anyone acknowledging it. He looked surprised, but he took the box. At that point, I probably should have left it there. Instead, I started explaining a little about how Aiden sometimes grips things too hard when he gets overwhelmed and how we're working with therapists on impulse control. I said kids like Aiden sometimes need a little extra patience from the people around them while they learn those skills. The conversation shifted almost immediately. Mark said he appreciated the replacement, but that Sam wasn't upset about the toy anymore. He said the bigger issue was that Sam didn't enjoy playing with Aiden and felt stressed when things got chaotic. He wasn't cruel about it, he was calm, which somehow made it worse. Because calm makes it sound like the situation is settled and reasonable and finished. I told him I understood kids needing space sometimes, but I also said that when one child gets labeled as too much by a group, it tends to stick long after the behavior improves. He nodded but didn't really respond to that. Later that evening, he came back and left the toy box on our porch. No note, just the box. That was the first moment where I realized that nothing I did was going to repair the dynamic the way I had hoped. After that, I tried something different. Instead of trying to fix individual relationships, I thought maybe the whole situation needed more structure. The park had always been a free-for-all, kids running around making up games while parents watched from the benches. For most kids that works fine. For kids like Aiden, it can become overwhelming quickly, so I decided to organize something a little more intentional. I put together what I called a guided play hour. Nothing formal, just a couple simple cooperative games, some sensory toys Aiden likes, and a plan to help the kids interact without things getting chaotic. I printed out a little sign with the idea written on it and brought a bag of equipment to the park one Saturday morning. I posted about it in the neighborhood chat too. I said I thought it might help kids learn how to play together more comfortably, especially when different personalities are involved. No one argued with the idea, but no one came, not a single kid. Aiden and I played the games by ourselves while the sign sat on the picnic table. After about 40 minutes, he asked why the other kids weren't coming. I told him maybe they had other plans. Later that same afternoon, I drove past the park on my way back from the grocery store. The entire playground was full. Kids everywhere. The exact same group that used to come in the mornings. They were all there during the afternoon slot that had slowly become the new routine. Seeing it like that, full of kids who used to share the space with Aiden, hit harder than I expected. I didn't stop, but it stayed with me. Around that same time, another situation came up that pushed things further. One of the families in the neighborhood was hosting a birthday party for their daughter. A bunch of the kids from the park group were invited. Kyle mentioned it casually one evening because several of the older kids were talking about it at school. Aiden wasn't invited, which is fine. No child is entitled to an invitation to every party, but the guest list was basically the entire Saturday park group, so I messaged the parent hosting it. I tried to keep the message neutral. I asked if the guest list had been limited and whether there had been a reason Aiden wasn't included. She replied politely that they had to keep the party small. But when Kyle later mentioned how many kids had actually gone, it became obvious that small wasn't really the factor. At that point, I told Aiden the truth in the simplest way I could. I said sometimes people don't understand kids who behave differently. He was quiet for a while after that. Then he asked if he was the reason the other kids played at a different time now. That question sat in my chest for the rest of the night. A few days later, I made a decision that a lot of people here will probably say was the turning point where I should have stopped. Instead of avoiding the afternoon park group, I decided to take Aiden there. The park is public. The space belongs to everyone. Adjusting our entire routine indefinitely didn't seem like a fair expectation. So one Saturday, we showed up in the afternoon. The reaction was immediate. The kids didn't say anything cruel, but you could feel the shift in the air. Games slowed down. A couple kids drifted towards their parents. Sam walked over to Mark and asked something quietly. Within 10 minutes, several families started packing up. Aiden noticed. He didn't have a meltdown or anything like that. He just asked why everyone was leaving so early. I told him sometimes people have other plans, but the look on his face told me he wasn't convinced. After that day, I made a mistake that I now realize poured gasoline on the situation. I wrote a post on Facebook. I didn't mention names. I didn't mention the park directly. I just wrote about how some communities talk about kindness while quietly teaching children to exclude kids who are different. I said that moving social activities, instead of addressing discomfort, sends a message to every child watching. Screenshots started circulating among the parents here within hours, which led to the moment that almost got me into real trouble. The following week, I decided to try something again with the park. I wanted to make sure the afternoon group understood that Aiden had as much right to be there as anyone else. So when we arrived and the kids started drifting away like before, I tried to stop the cycle. I stood near the exit path and asked one of the parents if we could talk for a moment about what was happening. More parents gathered because they could see a conversation starting. I was frustrated. I said people were teaching their children avoidance instead of empathy. Someone told me I was making everyone uncomfortable. Voices got louder, not screaming but tense enough that someone walking their dog nearby apparently thought something serious was happening because a police car showed up. 2 officers got out and asked what was going on. That moment was surreal. Standing in a park explaining a neighborhood playground dispute to police officers. One of them pulled me aside and asked if I was blocking people from leaving. I said I had been trying to have a conversation, not trap anyone. The other officer spoke to a couple of the parents. In the end, they didn't treat it like a crime. They basically said everyone should go home and cool off. One of them told me gently that if people feel physically prevented from leaving a space, even briefly, it can escalate into something that requires intervention. Then he added that it sounded like I was under a lot of stress and just trying to advocate for my child, so they left it at a warning. But the embarrassment of standing there with police lights reflecting off the playground equipment while a bunch of neighbors watched was something I won't forget anytime soon. After that incident, the atmosphere here shifted again. Parents stopped even pretending to be neutral. A few people who used to at least nod politely now avoid eye contact entirely. Kyle has basically checked out of neighborhood life. He spends most of his time at friends' houses across town, and Aiden still asks every Saturday if anyone else will be at the park. Which brings me to where my head is now. I've started seriously thinking about moving. Not because I'm angry in some dramatic way, but because I'm realizing something about this place that I didn't see when we first arrived. Communities love the idea of kindness when it's easy. When kindness requires inconvenience, patience, or adjusting routines, most people quietly step away. And maybe that's human nature. But if that's the culture here, then maybe this isn't the place where Aiden is going to grow up feeling accepted. So I've started looking at other neighborhoods, places with stronger inclusion programs, maybe closer to schools that specialize in mixed needs classrooms. I'm not naive enough to think every community will be perfect, but I also don't want to keep fighting the same quiet battle every weekend. Maybe the healthiest move is simply to find somewhere that already believes in the kind of environment I've been trying to create here. Right now, that feels like the direction things are heading. And honestly, after everything that's happened over the past few weeks, leaving might be the one decision that finally gives everyone, including Aiden, some breathing room. Analysis. It's the collision of 2 completely legitimate parenting instincts that cannot coexist in the same social space once they harden. On one side, you have a parent whose entire life has trained her to fight against exclusion. Parents of high needs, children often live inside a constant, low-grade siege mentality. Not because they want conflict, but because they've seen how quickly their child becomes the problem in any unstructured environment. When you live with that pattern long enough, you start recognizing the early signals: people leaving early, invitations thinning out, and conversations becoming polite but shorter. To someone in that position, those signals are not neutral social drift, they are warning flares. So the narrator's instinct becomes intervention. She tries to reset narratives, create structure, and confront the slow social distancing before it calcifies. From her perspective, passivity equals surrender. If she doesn't push, the outcome is predetermined. Her son becomes the kid everyone quietly works around. The problem is that the tools she's using, moral pressure, public framing, escalation work in institutional settings, schools, workplaces, organizations, but almost never work in informal social ecosystems like neighborhood playgroups. Those spaces run on something far less explicit than rules. They run on comfort economies. People show up because it feels easy. The moment participation requires negotiation, explanation, or emotional labor, most families drift away without confrontation. Not out of cruelty, but because leisure time is one of the few spaces adults protect from friction. So when the narrator introduces structure, messages about responsibility, or moral language about inclusion, she's unknowingly changing the entire social contract of the park. What used to be casual recreation begins to feel like a managed environment with expectations. At that point, even parents who might sympathize with her situation start recalculating whether they want their Saturday morning governed by someone else's advocacy project. That's the first structural tension. The second tension is about children's boundaries versus adult values. The narrator is operating from an adult moral framework. Communities should help children who struggle socially. That principle is defensible, even admirable. But the other parents are operating from a much simpler rule. Their children are allowed to avoid interactions that consistently make them uncomfortable. Neither principle is obviously immoral, but they point in opposite directions. One prioritizes collective responsibility. The other prioritizes individual comfort and autonomy. When those two frameworks collide, the side advocating responsibility almost always loses in casual social environments because responsibility requires effort while avoidance requires only silence. What's interesting psychologically is that the narrator recognizes this dynamic but interprets it through a moral lens rather than a structural one. She sees the outcome as evidence of selfishness rather than recognizing that most informal communities are structurally incapable of supporting high-needs dynamics without deliberate leadership. In other words, the neighborhood isn't necessarily cruel. It's simply operating under the default rules of voluntary social life. Another layer that complicates the story is the invisible burden carried by the older sibling. Kyle's position reveals a tension that often exists in families navigating disability but rarely gets discussed openly. Siblings experience the social consequences of accommodation systems they did not choose. His gradual withdrawal isn't cruelty towards his brother. It's a coping mechanism for a social environment where his identity is constantly tethered to someone else's challenges. The narrator interprets his frustration as a failure of solidarity. From Kyle's perspective, it's probably exhaustion. Then, there's the father figure in the story. His role is fascinating because he embodies a kind of quiet authority that shapes social norms without ever appearing aggressive. By consistently framing his decisions around his child's comfort, he establishes a precedent that other parents find easy to follow. He doesn't organize exclusion. He simply models disengagement. And in decentralized social groups, modeling behavior is often more influential than explicit coordination. That dynamic likely contributes to the narrator's feeling that he holds influence, even if he never actively wields it. The police incident is the moment where the conflict stops being philosophical and becomes physical. It's not about law enforcement in any dramatic sense. What matters is that the narrator crossed the invisible line where advocacy begins to feel like social coercion. Blocking people's exit even briefly transforms a moral conversation into a perceived threat to autonomy. Once that happens, the neighborhood stops interpreting her behavior as advocacy and begins interpreting it as instability. That shift is almost impossible to reverse in small communities. The most revealing moment in the update isn't the confrontation or the Facebook post. It's the narrator concluding that the neighborhood lacks empathy and considering moving somewhere more inclusive. That decision actually makes sense from her internal logic. If the environment repeatedly produces the same outcome, relocation appears rational. But what's unresolved is whether the problem is the specific neighborhood or the type of social environment she's trying to force into functioning differently. Casual neighborhood playgroups rarely sustain inclusion for children with high regulation needs without explicit adult facilitation from the start. The narrator tried to introduce that facilitation after the social norms had already solidified. By then, the group had already defined itself around ease, so the story ends in a strange moral gray zone where nobody is entirely wrong, but the system still fails the child who needs it most. The neighborhood protects its comfort, the mother protects her son. Both actions are understandable, yet together they produce the very isolation everyone claims to oppose. That's the uncomfortable reality underneath the drama. Inclusion requires intentional structure, but most communities only value inclusion when it remains invisible and effortless. The moment effort becomes visible, people quietly walk away.